The prophet Nathan once stood before King David and declared a curse that would echo through generations. "The sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised the word of the Lord." Little did the kingdom know that this sword would take the form of the most beautiful man in all Israel, a son born from David's own flesh, destined to pierce his father's heart deeper than any enemy blade ever could. His name was Absalom, and from the moment he drew breath, destiny marked him for tragedy. In the scrolls of divine judgment, his story was written before the first stone was cast, before the first conspiracy whispered in shadowed corridors. Listen closely, for this is no mere tale of rebellion. This is prophecy incarnate, where every kiss conceals betrayal, where every crown stolen demands a reckoning, where beauty itself becomes the instrument of doom. Watch as the threads of fate weave tighter, a violated sister crying out for justice that never comes, a father king paralyzed by his own guilty past, and a golden prince whose ambition burns hotter than the sun over Jerusalem. The Lord's judgment moves like a storm gathering on the horizon, slow, inevitable, terrible. And when it breaks, even the trees of the forest will become executioners. Among all the sons born to King David in the royal palace of Jerusalem, one stood out above the rest. His name was Absalom, and he was the third son of David, born to Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. This meant that Absalom had royal blood, both on his father's and mother's side, since she was a princess twice over. But what truly set Absalom apart from his brothers and from every other man in Israel was his extraordinary appearance. The scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 25 tell us that in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. From head to toe, this man was perfect. Not a single flaw marked his body. His face was handsome beyond measure, his build strong and impressive, and people throughout the kingdom talked about his appearance. Yet even more remarkable than his flawless features was Absalom's hair. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 26 describes how, when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it. When it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head, 200 shekels by the king's weight. His hair grew so thick and long that once a year, when it became too heavy to bear, he would cut it, and when he did, it weighed about 5 pounds. Imagine the sight of this prince walking through Jerusalem's streets, his magnificent hair flowing, his perfect face drawing every eye. Absalom knew the effect he had on people. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, never been rejected, never been overlooked. In the palace, among his many brothers and sisters, he stood out. David had many sons from different wives, but Absalom possessed something special, a magnetic presence that made people stop and stare. He was admired, celebrated, and favored by many who saw him as the natural choice to one day sit on his father's throne. Absalom had a sister named Tamar, born from the same mother. She was beautiful, just as her brother was handsome, and she was a virgin, as was proper for an unmarried daughter of the king. But Tamar had another half-brother named Amnon, who was David's firstborn son, the heir to the throne. And 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 1 tells us that Amnon, the son of David, loved her. But this was not true love. It was obsession, a sick desire that consumed Amnon until he became physically ill from wanting what he could not have. His friend Jonadab, described in verse 3 as a very crafty man, noticed Amnon's condition and asked him why the king's son looked so haggard morning after morning. Amnon confessed, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab devised a wicked plan. He told Amnon to pretend to be sick, and when David came to check on him, to request that Tamar come and prepare food in his sight so he might eat from her hand. Amnon followed this evil advice. When David visited, Amnon made his request, and the king, suspecting nothing, sent word to Tamar, Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." Tamar obeyed her father. She went to Amnon's quarters and began making bread while he watched from his bed. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verses 8 and 9 describe how she took dough and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. Then Amnon gave a command that revealed his true intentions. He ordered everyone else to leave the room. When they were alone, verse 11 says, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." Tamar was horrified. She answered him in verse 12, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing." She begged him to stop trying to reason with him. She even suggested in verse 13 that he speak to the king, saying, "He will not withhold me from you." Anything to prevent what was about to happen. But Amnon would not listen. Verse 14 records the terrible moment. But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. In that moment, Tamar's life was destroyed. Her future, her honor, her dignity, all stolen by a man who called himself her brother. Then something even more twisted happened. Verse 15 says, "Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her." The obsession that had made him sick now turned to disgust. He called his servant and said in verse 17, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." Tamar left Amnon's house wearing the long robe with sleeves that marked her as a virgin princess, a robe she would never rightfully wear again. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 19 tells us, "Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went." She walked through the palace compound in public shame, her cries announcing to everyone what had been done to her. Absalom found his sister in this devastated state. The scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 20, record his first words to her. "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" He already knew the answer before she spoke. The torn robe, the ashes, the tears, everything told the story. Absalom's response was carefully controlled, but filled with layers of meaning. He said to Tamar, "Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." Some might hear these words and think Absalom was dismissing his sister's pain, but they would be wrong. He was telling her to be silent for now, not forever. He was telling her not to let this destroy her completely, because he had plans. The phrase, "He is your brother," was not an excuse for Amnon's crime. It was Absalom acknowledging the complexity of what would come next. This was not just any rapist. This was the king's firstborn son, the heir to the throne, their own half-brother. Any response would shake the entire royal household. The verse continues, "So Tamar lived, a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. He took her in, gave her shelter, protected her." But the word desolate tells us everything about Tamar's condition. She was ruined in the eyes of society, unmarriageable, broken, and every single day that Absalom saw his sister living in this state, his rage grew. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 22 gives us a crucial insight into Absalom's character. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Notice what it does not say. It does not say Absalom confronted Amnon. It does not say he shouted or threatened or made a scene. Instead, Absalom spoke to Amnon, neither good nor bad. He said nothing at all. This silence was more dangerous than any threat. Absalom was not a man of impulsive anger. He was cold, calculating, patient. While others might have exploded in rage and sought immediate revenge, Absalom controlled himself completely. He watched Amnon move freely through the palace. He saw his half-brother laugh and eat and sleep peacefully, unpunished for his crime. And with each passing day, Absalom's hatred burned hotter, fueled by his sister's ongoing suffering and his father's inaction. The beautiful prince with the perfect appearance was learning to wear a mask. On the outside, he maintained his composure, his princely dignity. But inside, a plan was forming. A plan that would require patience, timing, and the perfect opportunity. Absalom was willing to wait because he understood that revenge served cold was more effective than hot anger. He would give Amnon no warning, no chance to prepare or defend himself. When the moment came, it would be swift and final. When the news of Tamar's rape reached King David, his reaction should have been immediate and severe. 2 Samuel, chapter 13, verse 21, tells us simply that when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. The Hebrew word used here conveys burning anger, intense rage. David was furious about what his firstborn son had done. But that is where the verse ends. David was angry, and then he did nothing. No punishment was ordered. No justice was served. No consequence came to Amnon for violating his sister. The heir to Israel's throne had committed a terrible crime, and the king, who was supposed to enforce God's law, remained silent. Why? The scriptures do not tell us David's reasoning directly, but we can understand from what we know about his past. David himself had committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband Uriah. The prophet Nathan had confronted him, and God had forgiven David, but the prophet also declared that the sword would never depart from David's house because of his sin. Perhaps David felt he had no moral authority to judge his son when he had done even worse. Perhaps his guilt paralyzed him. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Amnon was David's firstborn, his heir, the son who would inherit the throne. To punish Amnon severely, to execute him as the law demanded for such a crime, would mean losing his successor. David loved his sons even when they did evil. His love made him weak when he needed to be strong. But David's inaction sent a clear message throughout the royal household. It told everyone that if you were the king's favorite, if you were important enough, if David loved you enough, you could get away with anything. Even the most horrible crimes could go unpunished. It told Tamar that her suffering did not matter as much as protecting Amnon's position. It told all the other sons that their father's justice was not blind, it had favorites. And it told Absalom that if he wanted justice for his sister, he would have to take it himself. David's silence was not just a failure to act, it was a decision that set everything else in motion. Every day that passed without Amnon facing consequences was another day that the kingdom's respect for David's authority eroded. Every day was another day that Absalom's contempt for his father grew. The king who had killed Goliath, who had defeated the Philistines, who had established Israel's throne, this same king could not bring himself to discipline his own son. In Absalom's eyes, his father was no longer the mighty king of legend. He was a weak old man who let his emotions control his decisions, who played favorites, who failed to uphold the very laws he was supposed to enforce. This realization changed something fundamental in Absalom's view of his father and of the throne itself. Absalom did not act immediately. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 23 opens with these words, "After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep-shearers at Baal-Hazor, which is near Ephraim." 2 full years passed between Tamar's rape and Absalom's revenge. For 24 months, Absalom maintained his silence around Amnon. For 2 years he watched and waited and planned. This patience was remarkable. Many men would have struck in the heat of anger within days or weeks of the crime, but not Absalom. He understood that time was his ally. The longer he waited, the more Amnon would relax, the more everyone would assume that perhaps Absalom had accepted what happened, that perhaps he had moved on. 2 years was long enough for people to lower their guard, to forget to be watchful, to assume the danger had passed. When Absalom finally made his move, He chose his moment perfectly. Sheep shearing time was a season of celebration in ancient Israel, much like harvest festivals. It was a time when work was done and people gathered to feast and drink and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Absalom invited all the king's sons to join him at Baal Hazor for this celebration. On the surface, it seemed like an olive branch, a gesture of family unity, a sign that Absalom wanted to bring the royal brothers together in fellowship. But Absalom had another request. Verse 24 says, "And Absalom came to the king and said, 'Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant.'" He invited David himself to attend. This was clever for two reasons. First, it made the invitation seem innocent. If he was inviting the king, surely he meant no harm. Second, Absalom likely knew his father would decline. And David did decline. Verse 25 records his response, "But the king said to Absalom, 'No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you.'" David understood that the king traveling with his full entourage would be expensive for Absalom to host. He pressed Absalom, but Absalom pressed back. Then came Absalom's real request, mentioned in verse 26. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." This was the ask Absalom had wanted all along, Amnon specifically. David's response is telling, and the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" Even David sensed something was off about this specific request, but Absalom pressed him, and finally verse 27 says, "David sent with him Amnon and all the king's sons." Now Absalom had what he needed. Amnon would be away from Jerusalem, away from the palace guards, away from his father's protection. He would be at Absalom's feast, surrounded by Absalom's servants, drinking Absalom's wine. And Absalom had already given his servants their instructions, recorded in verse 28. Then Absalom commanded his servants, "Mark, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." The plan was set. Absalom would wait until Amnon was drunk, his reflexes slowed, his judgment impaired. Then, at Absalom's signal, his servants would strike. Absalom assured them they would not be held responsible. He was taking full responsibility with his command. He was ordering them as their prince. And he encouraged them to be brave and strong, using language that echoed military commands, treating this assassination as a battle to be won. The feast at Baal Hazor began like any celebration. Wine flowed freely, food was abundant, and the king's sons relaxed among the festivities. Amnon, the heir to the throne, had no reason to suspect danger. 2 years had passed since Tamar's assault. If Absalom had wanted revenge, surely he would have taken it by now. Amnon drank deeply, his guard completely down. Then, just as Absalom had planned, when Amnon's heart was merry with wine, the moment came. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 29 describes what happened next. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. At Absalom's signal, his servants struck down Amnon. The firstborn son of King David, the heir to Israel's throne, was killed at a feast by his own brother's men. The verse continues with the immediate aftermath. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. Panic erupted among the princes. If Absalom had killed Amnon, were they next? Was this the beginning of a massacre? They did not wait to find out. Each brother grabbed his mule, the common transportation for royalty in those days, and fled in different directions, racing back toward Jerusalem and safety. Meanwhile, a messenger reached David with devastating news. But the report was wrong. Verse 30 says, "While they were on the way, news came to David, 'Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left.'" Someone had seen the chaos, seen princes fleeing in every direction, and assumed the worst. They ran ahead to tell the king that all his sons were dead. The next verse captures David's response to this horrific news. Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth, and all his servants who were standing by tore their garments. David literally fell to the ground in grief. He tore his royal robes, a sign of the deepest mourning. His servants did the same, joining their king in his anguish. For a moment, David believed he had lost all his sons in a single day. But then Jonadab spoke up, the same Jonadab who had helped Amnon devise the plan to rape Tamar in the first place. Verse 32 records his words. "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar." Jonadab revealed that he had known all along that Absalom intended revenge. He assured David that only Amnon was dead. Verse 34 confirms this. But Absalom fled, and the young man who kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. The watchman could see the other princes approaching Jerusalem, alive and safe, and verse 37 reveals what happened to Absalom. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son day after day. Absalom had run to his grandfather's kingdom, to his mother's father, knowing he would find protection there. He could not stay in Israel after killing the king's firstborn. But notice the final line. David mourned for his son. Which son? The verse is deliberately ambiguous. Was David mourning for Amnon, who was dead? Or was he mourning for Absalom, who was now a fugitive? Perhaps both. David had lost two sons that day, one to death, one to exile. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 38 tells us what happened next. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. 3 full years Absalom spent away from Jerusalem, away from Israel, living in his grandfather's kingdom. He had avenged his sister, but the cost was exile from everything he knew, from his home, from his father, from his future. During these 3 years, something important was happening in David's heart. Verse 39 reveals this. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon, since he was dead. As time passed and David's grief over Amnon's death eased, his thoughts turned increasingly to his living son. David began to long for Absalom, to wish he could see him again, to desire reconciliation. But David did nothing about these feelings. He made no move to bring Absalom home. He sent no messengers, issued no pardon, extended no invitation. David longed for his son, but remained paralyzed by his own emotions and perhaps by his sense of what was right. Amnon had raped Tamar without punishment. Absalom had murdered Amnon in revenge. How could the king simply forgive that? Yet how could a father continue to reject his own son when his heart ached for him? So David did nothing. And Absalom remained in Geshur, knowing his father longed for him, but would not call him home. We can only imagine what those 3 years did to Absalom's mind. He had plenty of time to think about his father's pattern of inaction. David had failed to punish Amnon for 2 years. Now David was failing to restore Absalom for 3 years. The king seemed incapable of making hard decisions when it came to his sons. Absalom likely reflected on all his father's weaknesses during this exile. David's past sins with Bathsheba and Uriah were well known. His failure to discipline his children was becoming legendary. His emotional nature made him vulnerable to manipulation. These 3 years in Geshur were not just exile for Absalom, they were a time of transformation. The prince, who had left Jerusalem seeking justice for his sister, was becoming someone different, someone harder, someone with larger ambitions than simple revenge. Joab, David's nephew and military commander, recognized that the situation could not continue indefinitely. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 1 says, "Now Joab the son of Zeruiah knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom." Joab saw David's longing and decided to manipulate the king into action. Joab's plan was elaborate. He brought a wise woman from Tekoa and coached her to pretend to be a mourner. He gave her a story to tell the king, a parable, really. The woman came before David and told him she was a widow with 2 sons. Her sons had fought in a field where no one could separate them, and one killed the other. Now her whole clan was demanding that she hand over her surviving son to be executed for his brother's murder. If she did this, she would have no sons left, no one to carry on her family name. David's response, recorded in verse 11, was immediate. "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." He promised to protect her remaining son. Then the woman revealed the trap in verse 13. "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God?" For in giving this decision the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. She was pointing out David's contradiction. He would show mercy to a stranger's son who committed murder, but not to his own son. David realized he had been manipulated, and when he asked who put her up to this, she admitted in verse 19 that, "Joab, your servant, commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant." David called for Joab and finally gave the order everyone had been waiting for. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 21 records it. "Behold, now I have granted this. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." After 3 years, David was allowing his son to return home. But there was a devastating condition. Verse 24 gives David's full instructions. "And the king said, 'Let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence.' So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. Absalom was allowed to return to Jerusalem, but he was forbidden from seeing his father's face. He was home, but not home, restored, but not restored. He could live in the city of his birth, walk its streets, see its people, but he could not enter the palace, could not speak to his father, could not be truly reconciled. This partial restoration might have been worse than exile, because every day Absalom lived with the reminder that David still rejected him. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 28 tells us how long this painful situation lasted. So Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. 2 more years, first 2 years watching Amnon go unpunished, then 3 years in exile. Now 2 more years living in Jerusalem but banned from his father's presence. 7 years total of various forms of rejection and distance. These 7 years had changed Absalom completely. The prince who once sought only justice for his sister had learned hard lessons about power, about weakness, about how kingdoms really work. He had learned that David could be manipulated, that the king's emotions made him vulnerable, that justice in Israel was not blind but favored whoever David loved most at the moment. And perhaps most importantly, Absalom had begun to see himself not as David's son seeking restoration, but as someone who might make a better king than his father. After 2 years of living in Jerusalem without seeing his father's face, Absalom's patience ran out. He needed to end this partial exile, this halfway punishment that left him suspended between acceptance and rejection. So Absalom decided to force a meeting with David, but he needed help. The person who could arrange this was Joab, the commander who had brought him back from Geshur in the first place. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 29 tells us what Absalom did. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but Joab would not come to him. And he sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Absalom summoned Joab once, and the commander ignored him. He summoned him again, and Joab still refused to come. Perhaps Joab was busy with military matters. Perhaps he felt he had already done enough by bringing Absalom home. Perhaps he sensed that getting involved further would be dangerous. Whatever the reason, Joab would not respond to Absalom's calls. So Absalom chose a dramatic way to get Joab's attention. Verse 30 records his command. Then he said to his servants, "See, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Absalom ordered his men to burn Joab's barley field, which was next to his own property. This was not a small gesture. Barley was valuable, and destroying someone's crop was a serious offense. But Absalom knew it would work, and it did. Verse 31 says, "Then Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house and said to him, 'Why have your servants set my field on fire?' Joab came immediately, demanding to know why Absalom had destroyed his property. Now Absalom had the commander's full attention, and he spoke plainly about his frustration. Verse 32 gives us Absalom's response. Absalom answered Joab, "Behold, I sent word to you, come here that I may send you to the king, to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Absalom's words cut to the heart of the problem. What was the point of bringing him back from Geshur if he could not see his father? This halfway restoration was worse than exile. At least in Geshur, Absalom had dignity. Here in Jerusalem, he was a prince in disgrace, living in his own house but banned from the palace like a criminal. Absalom told Joab to take a message to the king, "Either give me full restoration or execute me." This suspended state was unbearable. If David truly believed Absalom was guilty and deserved punishment, then let him carry out justice. But if David had forgiven him, then why this continued separation? Joab went to David and delivered Absalom's message. The king, who had longed for his son for years, finally agreed to see him. 2 Samuel. Chapter 14, verse 33 describes the moment of reunion. So Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. After 5 years of separation, 3 years in Geshur and 2 years in Jerusalem, father and son finally stood face to face. Absalom came before David and bowed with his face to the ground, the traditional posture of complete submission before the king. This was the proper way to approach royalty, showing respect and acknowledging authority. Absalom was not coming as an equal, but as a subject, as a son seeking his father's blessing, and David kissed him. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, this kiss was significant. It was a sign of acceptance, of peace, of restored relationship. When a father kissed his son after a long separation, it meant forgiveness. It meant the past was behind them. It meant they could move forward together. The kiss should have healed everything. But something was broken that could not be fixed with a kiss. 5 years was a long time, too long. During those years, too much had happened. Tamar still lived as a desolate woman in Absalom's house, still suffering from what Amnon had done and from David's failure to punish it. Absalom had killed his brother and lived in exile, then returned to a city where he was present but isolated. The kiss was a symbol, but symbols cannot undo years of pain and rejection. Absalom had learned things during those 5 years that changed him forever. He had learned that David's love was conditional, that the king played favorites, that justice in Israel depended on who you were rather than what you had done. He had learned that his father could be manipulated, first by Jonadab, who helped Amnon, then by Joab, who brought Absalom home, then by Absalom himself, who forced this meeting by burning Joab's field. The reconciliation was formal but empty. David kissed Absalom, but trust was not restored, love was not renewed, the relationship was not healed. Absalom rose from that kiss, still handsome, still charismatic, still brilliant, but fundamentally changed. He had come seeking his father's acceptance. What he found instead was confirmation that David was weak, that the throne of Israel was occupied by a man whose emotions controlled his decisions. After his reconciliation with David, Absalom was free to move throughout Jerusalem without restriction. He could enter the palace, participate in royal functions, and be seen by the people as a prince of Israel once again. But Absalom did not return to his old life. Instead, he began to present himself in a completely new way. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 1 tells us what Absalom did next. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. This was a dramatic departure from tradition in Israel. David himself, despite being king, maintained a relatively simple lifestyle compared to the monarchs of surrounding nations. He did not parade through the streets with great displays of wealth and power, but Absalom chose differently. He acquired a chariot, a vehicle associated with royalty and military might. Chariots were expensive, prestigious, and impressive to look at. He also got horses to pull this chariot, which was another sign of wealth and status. But most striking of all, he hired 50 men whose only job was to run in front of his chariot whenever he traveled through the city. Imagine the scene. Absalom, with his perfect appearance and his magnificent hair, riding through Jerusalem in a royal chariot. 50 strong men running ahead of him, announcing his approach, clearing the way, making sure everyone stopped and looked. This was theater, a carefully designed spectacle meant to impress the common people and plant an idea in their minds. This man looks like a king. This man acts like a king. No other prince in Israel traveled this way. Absalom was deliberately setting himself apart, elevating himself above his brothers, presenting himself as more than just one of David's many sons. He was making a statement with every public appearance. The chariot said, "I am powerful." The horses said, "I am wealthy." The 50 runners said, "I am important enough to command men." But this display was not just about showing off. It was the beginning of a political campaign, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Absalom was building a public image, creating an impression, making people associate him with royal authority and power. He wanted the citizens of Jerusalem and visitors from throughout Israel's tribes to see him and think of kingship. But Absalom's campaign was not just about appearances. He had a more direct and personal strategy for winning the people's loyalty. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 2 describes his daily routine. "And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, 'From what city are you?' And when he said, 'Your servant is of such and such a tribe of Israel,' Absalom positioned himself at the city gate every morning. In ancient Israel, the gate was not just an entrance to the city, it was the center of public life. This was where business was conducted, where legal disputes were heard, where people gathered to talk and exchange news. It was the place where you went if you needed to bring a case before the king for judgment. And Absalom made sure he was there before anyone else, intercepting people before they could reach David. His approach was personal and friendly. When someone approached with a legal complaint, Absalom would call out to them, ask what city they came from, engage them in conversation. He was not distant or formal like most royalty. He treated these common people like they mattered, like their problems were important to him personally. He learned their names, their towns, their tribes. He made them feel seen and heard. Then came the crucial part of his strategy, recorded in verse 3. Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." This was brilliant manipulation. Absalom would listen to someone's legal dispute and immediately validate them. He would tell them, "You're absolutely right. Your case is strong. You deserve justice." But then Absalom would plant doubt about David's administration. He would suggest that the king had failed to properly organize the judicial system. He would imply that David had not appointed enough judges throughout the kingdom, that people had to travel all the way to Jerusalem for justice. He was not directly attacking David, but he was subtly undermining confidence in the king's government. And then came the final stroke also in verse 3. Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land, then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." After making people doubt David's system, Absalom presented himself as the solution. If only he were in charge, if only he had the authority, then everyone would receive justice. Absalom's strategy went beyond words. He understood that people respond not just to what you say, but to how you make them feel. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 5 describes another crucial element of his approach. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. When someone approached Absalom at the gate, they would naturally bow or show respect because he was a prince. This was proper protocol, but Absalom would not allow it. Instead, he would reach out his hand, pull the person up or toward him, and kiss them. This physical gesture broke down the normal barriers between royalty and common people. It said, "I am not above you. I am one of you. We are equals." This was false humility, but it was powerfully effective. People were not used to being treated this way by royalty. They expected distance, formality, hierarchy. But here was a prince, the most handsome man in all Israel, riding in a chariot with 50 runners who would reach out and embrace them like a friend. It created a powerful emotional connection. People felt special, they felt valued, they felt like Absalom genuinely cared about them as individuals. And Absalom did this consistently. Verse 5 says, "Whenever a man came near, he would do this," not sometimes, not only to important people, to everyone. Rich or poor, from powerful tribes or small towns, every person who approached Absalom received this same treatment. He made each one feel important, heard, and valued. The result of this long-term campaign is recorded in verse 6. "Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment." So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Notice that word, stole. The hearts were not freely given, they were taken through deception. Absalom was running a con, manipulating people's emotions, building loyalty through false pretenses. But the people did not know this. They believed Absalom's act. They thought he was sincere. They contrasted him with David, the old king who stayed in his palace, while this young, energetic prince stood at the gate every morning, listening to their problems, validating their concerns, promising justice. In their minds, Absalom looked like the future. After years of this careful political work, Absalom was ready to make his move. But he needed to do it away from Jerusalem, away from David's immediate control, in a place where he could gather his supporters and make his claim to the throne. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 7 tells us his plan. "And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, 'Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron.'" 4 years. That is how long Absalom had been working at the gate, building his base of support, stealing the hearts of Israel. Now the moment had come, but he could not simply declare himself king in Jerusalem. He needed to get out of the city first, to gather his forces, to create momentum. So he came to David with a religious excuse. Absalom told his father that he had made a vow to the Lord and needed to go to Hebron to fulfill it. Verse 8 gives the explanation he offered. "For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying, 'If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord.'" He claimed that during his 3 years of exile in Geshur, he had promised God that if he ever returned to Israel, he would go to Hebron to worship and fulfill his vow. This sounded reasonable. Hebron was a significant city in Israel's history. It was where Abraham had lived and where he was buried. It was the place where David himself had first been crowned king over Judah before he became king over all Israel. David suspected nothing. Verse 9 records his response, "And the king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he arose and went to Hebron. David gave his blessing and let Absalom go." The king had no idea he was sending his son to start a rebellion, but Absalom was lying. There was no vow. Or if there was a vow, it was not the real reason for this trip. Absalom had chosen Hebron deliberately for strategic reasons. First, it was David's original capital, which gave Absalom's claim historical legitimacy. Second, it was far enough from Jerusalem to give Absalom time to organize before David could respond. Absalom did not go to Hebron alone. Verse 11 tells us, "With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing." Absalom brought 200 men from Jerusalem with him, but these men had no idea what was really happening. They thought they were going to a religious ceremony. Once Absalom reached Hebron, he activated the conspiracy he had been building for years. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 10 reveals the signal he had arranged. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, 'Absalom is king at Hebron.'" This verse shows us how carefully Absalom had planned this rebellion. He had not just been winning hearts in Jerusalem. He had been sending secret messengers throughout all 12 tribes of Israel, building a network of supporters in every region. These were people who had met him at the gate, who had been impressed by his chariot and his concern for justice, who believed he would be a better king than David. Absalom had given them all the same instruction: wait for the sound of the trumpet, then declare that Absalom is king. The trumpet was a brilliant signal. In ancient Israel, trumpets announced important events: the beginning of festivals, the calling of assemblies, the coronation of kings. When people throughout Israel heard trumpets blowing in their towns and cities, they would know something significant was happening. And Absalom's supporters would immediately begin declaring him king, creating a wave of proclamation that would sweep across the nation simultaneously. This was not a spontaneous uprising. This was a coordinated, nationwide coup attempt. Absalom had supporters planted in every tribe, waiting for his signal, ready to act the moment they heard that trumpet. The rebellion would not be centered in just one city. It would erupt everywhere at once. But Absalom had also secured himself a crucial ally. Verse 12 tells us, "And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city Gilo." Ahithophel was not just any supporter. He was David's personal counselor, one of the king's most trusted advisors. The man who had helped David make decisions, who knew the king's strategies and weaknesses. This man had turned against the king. The verse continues, "And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing." As soon as the rebellion was declared publicly, people flocked to Absalom's side. The momentum was entirely with Absalom. The news reached Jerusalem like a thunderbolt. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 13 records the moment David learned what was happening, and a messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." With those words, David's world collapsed. His son had not gone to Hebron to worship. He had gone there to steal the throne. David's response was immediate and shocking. Verse 14 gives his command. Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." David, the warrior king who had defeated Goliath, who had conquered the Philistines, this same David chose to run. He did not try to rally the army. He did not prepare Jerusalem's defenses. Instead, he ordered immediate evacuation. The messenger had told him that the hearts of the men of Israel had gone after Absalom. David understood what this meant. His son had successfully turned the nation against him. Verse 15 shows that David's servants remained loyal, and the king's servants said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides." They were with him, whatever he chose. So the evacuation began. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 16 describes the exodus. So the king went out, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. David walked out of his palace, abandoning the city where he had reigned for years. His entire household followed him, his wives, his children, his servants. But he left 10 of his concubines behind to maintain the palace. Verse 17 continues, "And the king went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. David and his loyal followers left Jerusalem and stopped at the edge of the city, at the last house before open country. There David paused to see who would come with him. Verse 18 says, "And all his servants passed by him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath, passed on before the king." David's personal guard, his foreign mercenaries, his veteran soldiers, these men stayed with him. They passed by him in formation, showing their continued loyalty even as the nation turned to Absalom. This was David's darkest hour. His own son had stolen his throne. The people he had ruled had abandoned him. He was fleeing his capital city, not knowing where he would go or how this would end. When Absalom entered Jerusalem after David had fled, he needed to do something that would make it impossible for him to ever reconcile with his father. He needed to burn every bridge, to make a public statement so offensive that there could be no turning back. So Absalom turned to Ahithophel for advice on how to secure his position. 2 Samuel chapter 16 verse 20 tells us what happened. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give your counsel. What shall we do?" Absalom was asking his advisor for strategic guidance on how to solidify his claim to the throne. Verse 21 records Ahithophel's counsel. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." This was not just political advice, it was a deliberate act of ultimate disrespect. By taking his father's concubines, Absalom would be claiming ownership of everything that belonged to David. In ancient culture, taking a king's wives meant claiming his throne. The plan had 2 purposes. First, it would strengthen Absalom's supporters by showing them there could be no reconciliation with David. Second, it would publicly declare Absalom as the new king. Verse 22 describes what happened next. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went in to his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. They set up a tent on the palace roof, the same roof where David had once walked and seen Bathsheba bathing. Now, on that same roof, Absalom committed this public act of rebellion. The phrase, "in the sight of all Israel," is important. This was not done secretly. This was a public spectacle meant to be seen and known by everyone. Absalom wanted all of Israel to witness this act, to understand that he had completely rejected his father. This fulfilled a prophecy that Nathan had spoken to David years earlier. When David had sinned with Bathsheba and murdered Uriah, the prophet told him in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, "Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun." What Absalom did on that rooftop was the fulfillment of God's judgment on David's past sins. After securing his position through this shameful act, Absalom needed to decide his next move. David had fled Jerusalem, but he was still alive and still had loyal followers. Ahithophel knew that the key to winning this rebellion was to act quickly and decisively. 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 1 records Ahithophel's military strategy. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight." Ahithophel wanted to move immediately. He asked permission to select 12,000 soldiers and chase after David that very night. Verse 2 explains his reasoning. "I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king." Ahithophel's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. David and his followers had just fled Jerusalem. They would be tired, emotionally drained, and not expecting an immediate attack. A surprise assault at night would create chaos and fear. The key phrase is, "I will strike down only the king." Ahithophel was not proposing a massacre. He wanted to kill David and David alone. This would end the conflict immediately. Without David, there would be no rival claim to the throne. Verse 3 continues Ahithophel's argument. "And I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." Ahithophel promised that killing David would unite the nation under Absalom's rule. There would be peace because the conflict would be resolved quickly, with minimal bloodshed. The final sentence of verse 3 says, "So the advice seemed right to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel." Everyone agreed this was a good plan. Absalom liked it. His advisors approved it. If this plan had been executed, David would likely have been killed that night, and Absalom would have secured his throne permanently. Before Ahithophel's plan could be executed, another voice spoke up. Hushai, the Archite, had been David's friend and advisor, but when David fled Jerusalem, he sent Hushai back to the city with specific instructions. David told Hushai to pretend to support Absalom and to counter Ahithophel's advice whenever possible. 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 5 tells us, "Then Absalom said, 'Call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say.'" Before finalizing the decision to follow Ahithophel's plan, Absalom decided to get a second opinion. Verse 6 records what happened. "And when Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said to him, 'Thus has Ahithophel spoken. Shall we do as he says? If not, you speak.' Absalom explained Ahithophel's plan to Hushai and asked if they should follow it. Hushai knew he had to discredit Ahithophel's plan. Verse 7 says, "Then Hushai said to Absalom, 'This time, the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good.'" This was a bold statement. Ahithophel was known for his wisdom. Verse 8 records his reasoning. Hushai said, "You know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people." Hushai painted a picture of David as a dangerous, experienced warrior. He compared them to a mother bear whose cubs had been taken, the most dangerous animal you could encounter. Verse 9 continues, "Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place. And as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, 'There has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.'" Hushai suggested that David would set an ambush. Then Hushai appealed to fear. Verse 10 says, "Then even the valiant man, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men. Even brave soldiers would lose courage if they heard that David was fighting back successfully." After tearing down Ahithophel's plan, Hushai offered his own strategy in verse 11. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. Instead of a quick strike with 12,000 men, Hushai suggested gathering all of Israel's fighting men. Verse 12 continues, "So we shall come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all the men with him not one will be left." Hushai promised total victory. The result is recorded in verse 14. "And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, 'The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel.' For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom." Absalom chose Hushai's plan. The scripture makes it clear this was not just human decision-making. God was working to defeat Ahithophel's counsel. The delay caused by Hushai's counsel gave David crucial time. He crossed the Jordan River, gathered his forces, and organized his army. Meanwhile, Absalom assembled all the fighting men of Israel and prepared for battle. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 6 tells us where the battle took place. "So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim." This was not an open plain where large armies typically fought. This was a forest, thick with trees, difficult terrain. Before the battle began, David gave specific instructions to his commanders. Verse 5 records his command, "And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, 'Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom.' And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. David told his 3 top military leaders to be gentle with Absalom. Even though his son had betrayed him, David still loved him and wanted him spared. The battle itself was devastating for Absalom's forces. Verse 7 describes the outcome. "And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. 20,000 of Absalom's soldiers died in that one battle. But what killed most of these men was not David's soldiers, it was the forest itself." Verse 8 explains, "The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword." These, the difficult terrain of the forest, killed more men than the actual fighting. Soldiers got lost, fell into pits, were separated from their units. As the battle raged and Absalom's army fell apart around him, the rebel prince tried to escape. But his attempt to flee led to one of the most unusual deaths recorded in Scripture. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 9 describes what happened. "And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on." Absalom was riding his mule when he rode under a large oak tree. The branches were thick and low. As he passed underneath, his head got caught in the tree. Some traditions suggest it was his famous hair that got tangled in the branches. Others suggest his head simply went between branches that closed around his neck. The mule kept going, leaving Absalom hanging from the tree. The phrase, "suspended between heaven and earth," is powerful. Absalom was literally hanging in the air, unable to touch the ground, unable to reach up to free himself. He was caught between heaven and earth, belonging to neither, trapped in complete helplessness. This was the same man who had looked like a king riding through Jerusalem. The same prince whose perfect appearance had drawn all eyes. Now that beautiful appearance had become a trap. The very things that had made him stand out had led to his capture. One of David's soldiers saw Absalom hanging there. Verse 10 tells us, "And a certain man saw it and told Joab, 'Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak.' The soldier reported what he had seen to Joab. Joab's response, recorded in verse 11, shows his frustration. Joab said to the man who told him, "What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Joab could not believe the soldier had not killed Absalom when he had the chance. But the soldier refused, and his reason is recorded in verse 12. But the man said to Joab, "Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom." The soldier reminded Joab that David had publicly commanded his officers to deal gently with Absalom. Joab had no patience for this. Verse 14 records his response. Joab said, "I will not waste time like this with you." And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. Joab took 3 javelins and drove them into Absalom's heart while he hung helpless in the tree. This was a direct violation of David's command. The king had said to deal gently with Absalom, to spare his life. But Joab made a battlefield decision that David's emotional attachment to his son could not interfere with military necessity. Joab knew that as long as Absalom lived, he would be a threat. Even if captured, Absalom's supporters might try to free him. From a purely strategic standpoint, Absalom had to die, so Joab killed him, knowing he was disobeying the king's direct order. But Joab did not finish the job alone. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 15 tells us, "And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him." After Joab struck Absalom with the 3 javelins, 10 of Joab's personal soldiers surrounded the dying prince and finished killing him. With Absalom's death, the reason for the battle ended. Verse 16 says, "Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them." Joab immediately stopped the fighting. But what to do with Absalom's body? Verse 17 describes his burial. "And they took Absalom, and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. They threw Absalom's body into a pit, and covered it with a pile of stones. This was not an honorable burial. This was the burial of a criminal." David was waiting in the city of Mahanaim for news of the battle. He did not know if his army had won or lost. And most of all, he did not know if his son Absalom was alive or dead. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 24 tells us, "Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone." A watchman on the wall spotted a lone runner approaching. Verse 25 says, "The watchman called out and told the king. And the king said, 'If he is alone, there is news in his mouth.' And he came rapidly and drew near." A single runner usually meant news. Ahimaaz arrived first and called out in verse 28. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." Ahimaaz announced victory, but David's response, recorded in verse 29, shows what he really cared about. And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." David did not ask about the battle. He asked only about Absalom. The second messenger arrived. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 31 tells us, "And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, 'Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you.'" But again, David's only question, recorded in verse 32, was about his son. The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." The Cushite did not say directly that Absalom was dead, but David understood. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 33 describes his reaction. And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." David broke down completely. He cried out his son's name over and over. He wished he had died in Absalom's place. The victory meant nothing to him. The story of Absalom ends with a detail that shows the emptiness behind all his ambition. 2 Samuel. Chapter 18, verse 18 tells us something Absalom had done while he was still alive. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. And Absalom had built a monument to himself during his lifetime. He erected a pillar in the king's valley near Jerusalem. He explained why, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." This statement is interesting because 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 27 tells us that there were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. Absalom had 3 sons, yet when he built his monument, he said he had no son. This means that by the time Absalom built the pillar, all 3 of his sons had died. This was significant in ancient Israel. A man's legacy lived on through his sons. Without a son, your name would be forgotten. So Absalom built a stone pillar and named it after himself. The irony is painful. Absalom rebelled to take the throne and establish his own dynasty, but he had no sons. He was fighting for a throne he could not pass on to anyone. All his ambition was ultimately for nothing. The monument still stood there as a reminder. People called it Absalom's monument, just as he had intended. But instead of being a celebration of his greatness, it became a testimony to his failure. The beautiful prince who had everything ended up with nothing. No throne, no dynasty, no son to remember him. Just a stone pillar and a pile of rocks marking his shameful grave. If this story of betrayal, judgment, and tragedy moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button to join us as we continue exploring the powerful stories of Scripture that shaped history and reveal God's hand in human affairs. Share this video with someone who needs to hear how ambition without wisdom leads to ruin, and how the consequences of sin echo through generations. Leave a comment telling us what struck you most about Absalom's story. Was it his patience in planning, his skill in manipulation, or the heartbreaking end of a man who had no heir to remember him? We'll see you in the next biblical journey. Until then, remember, true greatness is not measured by the chariots we ride or the crowds we command, but by the legacy we leave in the hearts of those who truly know us.